Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. And this is the American Cetacean Society San Francisco Bay monthly speaker event. We meet the fourth Tuesday of most months, and we've now been doing this online format for the last few months, I think about 6 or 7. So, and it seems to be working pretty well. I'm Susan Hopp, a board member. I'm here with fellow board member Gail Koza. And for anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, ACS began in 1967 and is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and grants, awarding grants toward marine research. Regarding our grants, please look for an announcement soon on our new format that we're launching for grant applications. So we really appreciate your donations in support of our mission. No donation is too small. And it also helps defray our costs to do these Zoom webinars, where we're really thrilled because we're regularly attracting over 100 attendees. So tonight we're in for a very timely talk. Gray whale populations by one of the world's authorities on gray whales. And especially for our San Francisco Bay Area attendees, gray whales have been in the news pretty regularly of late, and not really for the reasons that we'd like. And so I think we're going to hear more about that tonight. So we are recording this session, and we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. And after the presentation, we'll do our best to get to them. So we are really honored to have Dr. Jim Sumich tonight. And I'd like to just tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll get started. So Jim is the author of a best-selling textbook on marine biology, which is now in its 11th edition. He's also the co-author of the widely adopted Marine Mammals Evolutionary Biology. He has taught marine mammal biology at the university level for more than 4 decades and has conducted research on gray whales from British Columbia to Baja California. Jim currently holds an affiliate faculty appointment at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center. Jim has authored or co-authored nearly 20 papers on gray whales and has published a general audience book, E. Robustus, The Biology and Human History of Gray Whales. It's a great book. I love that book. I have it. In tonight's talk, Gray Whale Populations, a Paradox, we'll hear from Jim on past and current distributions, migration patterns, genetics of gray whale populations, and potential future scenarios for this species given global climate change. So with that, Jim, thank you so much for being here, and I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for showing up this evening. What I'd like to do tonight is to just kind of update some information about gray whales, especially in relation to what's going on with some of the studies in distribution relating to the definition of gray whale populations. So what I'd like to do is to start out with a very brief introduction to gray whales, because I'm sure that most of you are pretty familiar with this. Cover a little bit about their feeding and migration patterns, and then really start looking at the populations that we think exist and also how we go about defining those. So the critter that we're talking about tonight is this guy right here. It's kind of an intermediate sized baleen whale. And on this poster that Uko Gordo did. It's intended to represent every species, and it's short quite a few, but almost every species, certainly every type of whale in existence right now. And the way this is laid out here, all of these on the left-hand side, including the humpback whale here, are baleen whales. Everybody else is a toothed whale. And so you can see that a gray whale in here is kind of an intermediate sized baleen whale, maxing out at something like 50, 55 feet, but they're not huge. 30 tons maybe at the maximum. They're unique in a lot of ways. Part of it is their distribution. They have strictly, well, almost strictly, a northern hemisphere distribution, and as far as we know, have always had through their entire evolutionary history. But there are several other characteristics as well. They are kind of mottled in appearance, and they have a lot of barnacles and cyanids that are on the surface and have a very intimate relationship with the host whale. These things are one of the things that make gray whales so easy to identify, because there are just no other whales. There are a lot of other whales that have barnacles and a lot of other whales that have whale lice, but no other species of whale have anywhere near the numbers that gray whales do. And this seems to be the result of a long-term coevolutionary process, because the species of barnacles that are on gray whales are found only on gray whales. They just don't exist anywhere else in the world. And several of the species of these small crustaceans that are associated with the barnacles, and on this picture, you can see these clusters of more salmon colored things in here, are these guys. These feed almost exclusively on gray whale skin. So some might consider them a parasite, some might consider them kind of a very small predator, but they also are species specific to gray whales. And so this is the only place that you're going to be able to find these things. In terms of distribution, currently we have what is generally considered two separate populations in the North Pacific Ocean. A Western population that has a range that we'll talk about a little bit later, but fundamentally they're kind of anchored during the summer feeding season along the east side of this Sakhalin Island off the Siberian coastline, with a few others along Kamchatka Peninsula. This is a very small group of animals. And then over on the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean, we have the main bulk of this population, numbering in the 20-some thousand with some variability. On this side, we're going to have to talk about migration patterns later, because right now we have a lot of questions about this. And this map certainly needs to be updated, and we'll get to that in just a bit. On the eastern side, the principal feeding grounds during the summer are the Bering Sea, especially the eastern half of the Bering Sea, and the adjacent Chukchi Sea into the Arctic Ocean here, with some drift of animals both eastward and westward along the tops of these two continents during the summertime. And then the migration, as you well know, is pretty well defined down the west coast of almost all of North America to Baja, excuse me, to Baja California for winter breeding areas. And it's these migrations that link these seemingly very important critical biological habitats. This one up here for feeding, and this one down here for calving and mating. Now, in the North Atlantic Ocean, we know there are lots and lots of subfossil remains that are less than 1,000 years old. And we have lots of good evidence that indicate that gray whales did exist in small numbers in the North Atlantic up into the 1700s. We have quite a bit of anecdotal evidence about major feeding areas around Iceland during the summertime. The migratory patterns are very speculative. These dots represent fossil finds of animals. So we know that gray whales were down here, presumably in the wintertime, kind of reflecting what North Atlantic right whales do in terms of migrating down this coastline and having winter breeding and calving activities here. A lot less defined characteristics on the eastern side. Again, fossil finds in through here. And so we're really guessing about what the migratory pattern looked like. But all the evidence indicates that whether there was one or two populations, an eastern and a western population in the North Atlantic 500, 1,000 years ago, there certainly is not now. Now, the current numbers are in flux, and we know that the population, because of commercial whaling, probably knocked down the entire number of gray whales in North Pacific to around 1,000 or so in the late 1920s. And after getting complete international protection on paper since 1937, but actually because there was a world war in there since 1946, the population has made a pretty dramatic comeback from almost nothing to when we really started getting some good census numbers in the 1960s. And there was pretty strong growth for the next couple of decades. And it looked like it was starting to level off someplace around 20,000 animals or so. And then in 1999, 2000, this population, and when I'm saying this population now, I'm talking about the eastern gray whale population, took a very, very, very large hit. This referred to as an unusual mortality event. We probably lost at least a quarter of the population, maybe even more than that, over a 2-year period. And most of the evidence suggested it was due to severe lack of nutrition, starvation, poor feeding, and it was very, very strongly and closely associated with an extremely strong El Nino event here in the eastern North Pacific Ocean that occurred in 1997-98. And so this was just kind of a follow-on consequence of that lack of productivity that occurred a couple of years earlier. And then we seem to be repeating the same thing all over again, maybe not quite as severe as the 99-2000 UME, but over the last couple of years, we've clearly had a large increase in the mortality of gray whales. And so it's starting to suggest that maybe 25, 26, 27,000 is kind of the maximum number that this habitat can support. And as the population grows in good years, when there's good feeding available, it gets knocked back down in poor feeding years. And so probably the new normal is going to be what we've been seeing for the last couple of decades. And that is an increase from around 18, 20,000 up to 25, 26,000 animals, and then a serious set of mortality events, and then a recovery again over the next decade or so, and then another UME, and I think we will just continue to see this. So I'd like to pin down the migration thing just a little bit. In terms of basically what the textbooks used to say, it was pretty straightforward, that gray whales are shallow water, near shore coastal migrators. And the migration, even though it's what we see mostly of gray whales along the coast here, the migration is simply a behavior that connects this important feeding ground with these apparently important reproductive grounds in Baja California. And then over on the eastern side, again, feeding areas here along Kamchatka and Sakhalin Island, which I think might be right there. And then a migration away from that in the wintertime. And the migration away, certainly here, is absolutely mandatory because this freezes over during winter months. And so regardless of the preference of the animals, they must leave this area and go someplace out of the Bering Sea. What they do, or at least most of them do, is do this extremely long coastal migration to Baja California. In terms of the migration, at least for what we see for the Eastern North Pacific population, there are really two migrations of adult animals that are kind of superimposed on each other, but they're a little bit different than each other. And just backing up a little bit, it's pretty clear now that the adults have a migratory pattern that seems to be pretty tightly tied to their reproductive behavior. But the juvenile animals may or may not participate in these migrations, or may participate in part of the migration, but they're not tied as tightly to the kind of time schedule that we see for sexually mature animals. So for those animals in the fall, toward the end of the summer feeding season in November, the first animals to leave are pregnant females. And in this population and in this species, in normal good feeding year conditions, the adult females have a 2-year reproductive cycle, with about half of the adult females being 1 year out of sync with each other. So in any 1 year, you've got these fairly late pregnant females. They've been pregnant for about 10 months or so, leaving the feeding ground. They're the first ones out of the feeding ground. So they're the vanguard of this migration down the coastline that we all see. And they're followed fairly quickly by the non-pregnant females and essentially all the adult males. And they all end up in the lagoons down here in fairly low latitudes. And with the pregnant females being the first ones in, but they're also, they tend to give birth either fairly early in their lagoon period, or more and more we're seeing births happening along the coast of California, especially the southern half of the California coast, well prior to their entry into the lagoons. But these are the females that enter first, and they are the last ones to leave. So they come in, they stop feeding way up here, they swam for 2 months as late pregnant females, getting more and more pregnant every day. They get down here, they give birth to a 1-ton baby, start nursing that up to 2.5 or 3 tons, and leave well into April, or very late March. The other animals, the non-pregnant females and the adult males, are into the lagoons. They tend to average about 30 or 40 days in the lagoons. So they're in, those females mate, they become pregnant, and they leave fairly quickly. So on the southbound migration, these two are kind of, when we look at them out there, we don't see two different phases of migrations, but we certainly do on the northbound migration in normal good feeding years, where we have this phase, what we call phase A, of early pregnant females and adult males leaving the lagoons after a month or so and making their way up north, so that they are ready to enter the Bering Sea just as soon as the ice retreats and allows them to get in. In contrast to that, females that gave birth and are now nursing are much slower to leave the lagoons, and much later to arrive in the summer feeding grounds. So, if you think about this, the females, the animals that have the hardest energetic work to do to produce a calf and then nurse it, and nurse it all the way back and grow it out, these are the females, or these are the animals that are away from their feeding grounds for the longest period of time. And then in the following year, the females just reverse their roles, and the males keep doing the same thing they've always done. Most of this pattern of migration was pretty well established back in the 1960s. And this is the publication that resulted from a 11-year study that was based on taking animals outside San Francisco Bay and then bringing them in, killing them, bringing them into Richmond for biological examination. And the study started out as a purposeful approach to look at the population to try to determine when commercial whaling could be resumed on the species. By the time that the study was over in 1969, 1970, we had our first Earth Day. All sorts of things started changing in terms of general attitudes. And so the focus of the study changed, and this is reflected pretty well in the title of this. And this has become the Bible for just about anybody that's doing any work on gray whales. The winter lagoons in Baja California there are three primary ones: Ojo de Libre, which some people call Scammons Lagoon, Laguna San Ignacio, where I've done most of my work here, and then this large Bahia Magdalena complex. And I have a feeling that quite a few of you that are in the audience tonight have been to at least one of these during the winter time to get a much closer look at gray whales. But this is basically the other end of the migration. And so as you're thinking about questions, you might think about, why do these animals go there? It's a long swim. But what we do see when we look at behaviors for the adults is that we see two very discrete kinds of behaviors. One is courting and mating of adult males and females that came south as non-pregnant animals and are probably very busily trying to get pregnant for their period of time in the lagoons. And the others, the other group, and even though they might be in the same lagoon, they tend to stay very, very segregated from each other. Mothers with newborn calves tend to stay in the more shallow, remote inland portions of the lagoons where the more active mating, courting animals tend not to go. And so much of the time, this looks like a very calm, quiet kind of situation, and it often is. It's the existence of these whales in these lagoons, especially in San Ignacio, but certainly the others as well, that has kind of given rise to this very, very strong eco-tourist activity that most people refer to as friendly whales, that you've either participated in this or you've at least seen videos like this all over the place.
Oh my gosh! Écoute, est-ce que c'est ça? Est-ce que c'est excellent? Oh. Oh my God. Look at them today, right here. Oh, the mom is also.
Okay, that's enough of that. They're having too much fun without us. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that easy access to very close interactions with gray whales has not only been the basis of a very large tourist industry, but it's also been the basis for a lot of the scientific research that's been done on gray whales. Because in some ways, it's almost like having animals in captivity without having the animals in captivity, that they are accessible, they're touchable in many cases, and there are quite a few different kinds of things that we can do with them in that kind of situation without ever restraining them. And some of them are getting fairly sophisticated. There's been a lot of work in over the last several decades in terms of trying to look at vocalizations and communication, especially between moms and calves, but maybe between courting adults as well. And it's really very, very difficult to put a hydrophone over the side of the boat and listen to the sounds that are being made, and then try to make some sense out of what you're seeing above the surface. So we've got a really short video here. Dr. Aaron Thode at Scripps has been working with some other colleagues. Basically what he's doing here is using a 2-drone system, one a wet drone, and it's actually sitting on the water right here. And that drone has a hydrophone hanging down from it, so it can record the underwater sounds while the drone that's actually videoing this can look at the behavior of the whales from a few hundred feet up. Well, what you're hearing there are snapping shrimp. They're small crustaceans that swarm over the bottom of these areas. And what you're hearing is sounds that these whales are making. And I'll try to point one out to you. Okay, that gurgling sound that you heard is one of the common vocalizations, but gray whale vocalizations are not really very interesting, certainly in comparison to humpback whales. And part of the problem is this tremendous staticky background noise that is always there, and it's hard to get around. But at least this is an approach to try to be able to simultaneously record the sounds they're making and watch the behaviors that's occurring at least at the sea surface. Okay, at the other end of the migratory path, gray whales typically are bottom feeders, although there's some evidence that they have a little more flexibility than that. Most gray whales have a preferred side that they feed on. They're primarily right-sided animals, and they tend to feed on a variety of small invertebrate, primarily crustaceans that are either on the seafloor or in tubes in the seafloor or swarming just above the seafloor. But they have a pretty intimate interaction with the seafloor itself. And as a consequence, during summertime, they tend to be feeding in really shallow water, anywhere from just a couple of meters, where you can see the animals on their side and their fin is sticking out of the water, to maybe 20 meters or so. But they're not known to be really deep divers. They're not known to be really good breath holders. And they don't really need to be. I mean, their blood characteristics in terms of its oxygen storing capacity is more like humans than it is like blue whales, for example. And this is, for an animal feeding on the bottom, what a very common behavior is to swim down to the bottom, spend 3 or 4 or 5 minutes sucking up invertebrate prey from the seafloor, and basically filling their mouth lined with this baleen basket with a mixture of mud and prey. And then when they're running out of air and they need to go to the surface to breathe, they pop up to the surface. They still have that mouthful of food, and they're basically flushing water in and out through the baleen, washing as much of the sediment out of it as they can before they dive and repeat the whole process again. Probably because they're benthic feeders and they encounter a lot of sediment, rocks, and things like that in their feeding activities, they have, relative to any of the other baleen whales, they have very coarse baleen. It's about the same consistency as a straw broom would be. But it's pretty good. It's not good at filtering out really very, very small filter or small prey like what right whales or bowhead whales feed on, but it certainly works for them. And like all other baleen whales, these baleen plates are arranged in 2 racks, one on each side of and attached to the upper jaw. And so it provides a fairly large filtering volume and a lot of surface area for filtering that works pretty well with these animals. And at the other end of the feeding food chain aspect, probably the single biggest mortality source outside starvation is killer whales. Killer whales, especially on calves, they probably take 30–35% of the calf crop of every year's average calf crop. So they are major predators of gray whales, and they have a lot of close and intimate interactions with each other. Okay, now to what I said I was going to talk about. There are all sorts of questions currently around not just this species, but lots of other species that have some sort of legal status as a protected group. And in this country, for marine mammals, all of both our US national and international regulations consider functional management units as populations. And for that, we need not only a biological definition of a population, but a kind of real world definition of a population in terms of how do you find who is in a population, who is in a different population, what are the boundaries of that population, and so on. And this is really kind of arcane to some people, but it's really fundamental in terms of how efforts and dollars get spent in terms of trying to define what is going on with especially populations that are in serious concern of becoming extinct, or at least of threatened. So what we have now, and it really pretty much reflects what our thinking was a decade and a half ago, two different populations, the Eastern and the Western North Pacific populations, that are defined legally as separate populations, and that the Eastern population, although it used to be on the US endangered species list, was removed from that list in 1994 and was considered a kind of an iconic success story for this kind of national regulation. In contrast, the Western North Pacific population was defined as seriously threatened, and that it, because of that status, has been examined very, very carefully over the last 15 or 18 years, or actually 25 years now. And it seems like when we first started doing this, it was really very, very clear that Eastern North Pacific gray whales are in the Eastern North Pacific, and the Westerns were in the Western, and that was it. But the more studies have been done over the last decade and a half or so, it seems like the situation is getting more and more confusing rather than clear. So just to put this in a historical context, a fairly recent historical context, 19th and 20th century whaling, both ship-based and shore-based, put a huge dent in populations on both sides of the North Pacific. And there were active, serious whaling endeavors on both sides of the North Pacific up into the early part of the 20th century. And when we look at logbook records that can give us some information about the numbers of animals taken, and notice that these are in 5-year increments along this scale. So there were not 600 animals taken in the Western group in 1 year, but that was over a 5-year period. But even so, when you add all this up into almost the start of World War II, there was a definite Western gray whale whaling industry. And well over 1,000 animals over that 3 or 4 decade period were taken out of that population. The whole point here is that we know 100 years ago, or a little more than that, there was a fairly moderately large number of gray whales on the western side of the North Pacific Ocean. Now, the others here, this has been the commercial take for the Eastern population that basically dwindled down to nothing after World War II. The Aboriginal take, this is a sanctioned take by permit for Aboriginal peoples on both sides, both the Siberian and Alaskan side, that occurs every year. So it averages about 140 animals or so. And then this is a little bit of the take that Rice and Woolman did for their study back in the 60s. So what I'd like to point out here, without reading papers to you, is that this is a publication that came out in 1914, and it describes the life history of the Western gray whale. Now, he says a California gray whale, but this is strictly just Korea. And if you read this, you know, all it says is basically that these animals on the western side of the North Pacific Ocean behave just like we see them doing over here 100 years ago, or a little bit more. But because of the intense whaling effort and also the starting with a much smaller population, those numbers got reduced fairly quickly. And so that by the time we got into the 1970s, there are a couple of publications that came out in the same journal, a few years apart. And notice the titles are exactly the same with the change of one word. So in this paper, the argument was that this population, this Western, or what they called the Korean stock then, was extinct. And Brownell and others, a couple of years later, provided a little bit of evidence that no, that's probably not. There still are animals over there. So what has happened since then is a tremendous burst of studies along this portion of the Sakhalin Island, this very, very, very small feeding area here and over here. And initially, when these feeding areas for summer feeding were defined, it was presumed that this was the remnant Western gray whale population, and that there were probably no more than 140 or 150 animals in that. It was also presumed that during wintertime, they leave these feeding grounds like good normal gray whales should do, and head south someplace to some southern low latitude breeding or calving grounds. Grounds that had never been identified in the literature by whalers or anything else like that. So there's always just been this question mark about where that was. Now, we think that along from Sakhalin Island, one side of the Japanese islands or another, there was a migratory path that came by the Korean peninsula here, where most of the commercial whaling was done 100, 120 years ago. But very recently, an adult-sized female gray whale got net entangled at this area right here and ended up on the in a Chinese coastal situation. And it was 4,000 miles or 4,000 kilometers south of Sakhalin, and it pretty much the same latitude as Cabo at the end of Baja Peninsula. So the thinking was, well, here's an animal that may be showing us where she was going for this wintertime activity down in here someplace, but we still had no real good evidence for that. And then as this work improved, it got messier and messier. So the three basic kind of approaches to really trying to identify and track individuals to determine where they belong and what their migratory behavior is, and using that as a basis for their definition of population. So one of the common approaches is to do photographic identification of individual animals. ideally over a long period of time so that you can get resites and re-identifications and make some judgments about what areas individual animals are using, what migratory paths they might be taking. Sometimes it's really, really difficult, but it's doable. Sometimes it's very easy. This is an animal that we see, that we see along the Oregon coast almost every year. She has been here since at least 1994. She has this big, she looks as though she might have been a ship strike victim. We don't know for sure. But this huge injury here on her back that's filled primarily with these cyanamids, these whale lice. And this one was taken in 1994. This one was taken 2 years ago. And it's still, it's very, very easy to identify her from a long distance. So I want to come back and talk about photo IDs here in just a little bit. Another approach, and a kind of a complementary approach, is to identify animals genetically, not only to identify them individually, but also to look at relationships between animals and where they're seen. And usually this is done in conjunction with photo IDs so that the two can supplement each other in that. And I'm not even going to try to explain this, but the point is that there are good genetic tests that are very, very practical to do now, that if you can get tissue samples, and it doesn't take much. This is a tissue sampling arrow that has been fired from a crossbow. It has a little, almost like a tennis ball rubber head here. So the idea is that it hits, it takes a little tiny bit of skin tissue, and then it pops back off into the water. It floats, and you drive the boat over and pick it up, and you've got your sample. And the other is radio tagging. So back in 2009 or so, Bruce Mate, who was also here at the Marine Mammal Institute, he had been trying to get the Russian government to give him permission to put some radio transmitters that are satellite monitored so that we can tell wherever the animals go, anywhere in the world. And the idea was you over here in late fall and tag some animals that are ready to leave on their southbound migration, and they head south and they go and they tell you where their winter grounds are, and end of story. Well, he finally got permission to tag one animal in 2010, and it had to be a male, and it had to be a subadult animal, because the Russians were very, very protective of the very small number of animals that were here, rightly so. And they did not want to have any sort of negative effects on potential breeding, mating animals that could contribute to recruitment into this population. So anyway, Bruce tagged this animal, waited around a few weeks for it to depart on its winter southbound migration. And this is what it did. And you're all probably fairly familiar with this. This is an animal that was named Flex. And we tracked it all the way over across the Sea of Okhotsk, around the Kamchatka Peninsula, all the way across the Bering Sea, through the Aleutian Islands, across the Gulf of Alaska, and down the coast. It hit the coast here, down the coast to right there, which was about 30 miles north of where Bruce Mate's office was at the time at Newport, Oregon. And the signal was lost. And we don't know whether the transmitter came off the animal or the system failed, the transmitter failed, the batteries failed. We don't know, but we had a story here that we just didn't understand. Why was this animal migrating east when it was supposed to be migrating south? And it turns out that because this animal was first identified in 1997, it was pretty well known. And it turns out that this got other people looking at old photographic ID catalogs and found that that this animal had already been in Vancouver Island, which I guess would be about right there in previous years. So that means that we know this animal, it's a subadult, and it's already made this trip across here twice. Well, this was enough to get a lot of people excited about radio tagging. And so the following year, Bruce was allowed to tag, I think, 6 animals here in Sakhalin. And of those 6, 2 transmitters were still functioning well by the time the animals were departing. And both of them did pretty much what Flex had done the year before. Across the Sea of Okhotsk, around Kamchatka, across the Bering Sea through the Aleutians, and heading toward the North American continent. Now, this one ceased to function right about this spot, so it's kind of the end of the story for this one. But the rest of this story you probably know. This was 2011. This animal named Varvara came all the way across, hit the coastline here about Queen Charlotte Islands, head south, got in close to the coast, went right by us. We went out and checked her out in the boat. She went all the way down Baja California, got to within about 100 kilometers of the tip of Baja California, did a U-turn, came back up, went into to San Ignacio Lagoon for 1 day, came back out and headed back north. Now, if you didn't know that this animal came from over here, if that tag was put on her, say down here someplace, and you followed what she was doing, this looks like the migratory behavior of a typical Eastern North Pacific animal. But we know she came from over here because that's where she was tagged. And after this point, she continued on over here. Next summer, she was found feeding over here. And so she made a complete round trip from here all the way essentially to Cabo and back again, and has probably done that other times as well. So now that got everybody looking at their genetic information, looking at photo ID catalogs, and over the next year or so, we found collectively all the way up and down the West Coast with people that are working on these in different areas, at least 6 animals that were photo ID'd both here in the summertime at Sakhalin and someplace around Vancouver Island during some other part of the year. There were 2 genetic matches between here and here. And then there were 23 photo ID matches between animals that were photographed in one of the winter lagoons in Baja California and summertime feeding areas over here. And there are a lot more than 6 more recently. So this work continues, but what we know at the present is that the animals that are seen over here in the summertime seem to belong to 2 and maybe 3, but at least 2 different genetic groupings. One group is very closely genetically related to the Eastern North Pacific population. The other group is genetically quite a bit more distinct, but both groups have animals that consistently swim over here and spend wintertime breeding, calving activities. There have been several females that have given birth to calves over here. There are several females that have given birth to more than 1 calf over here. And then go back. You know, we used to think of these animals as very shallow water, nearly always coastal migrators. And here they are charging across, you know, the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska in the wintertime and down most of the length of North America and doing it repeatedly. So the migration itself does not seem to be any sort of impediment to or a barrier to keeping these animals apart. We still don't know what's going on here, but let me back up for just a minute. But what we think might be happening, what we might have currently is a group of animals that are Western North Pacific gray whales, and that they're genetically identifiably different than the other group that is here that are very closely related to these guys over here. That first group may represent kind of a remnant population of what we used to call the Western or the Korean stock of gray whales. And that there may have been a fairly recent kind of immigration of another group of whales from the Eastern North Pacific over here. So we got this mishmash of animals over here, some of them going here, some of them maybe going south. And so we still don't have really good definitive ideas about the barriers of these. Now, in addition to that, and this is kind of right at the bottom edge of San Francisco's distribution, but we have another group of gray whales that are certainly behaviorally distinct and may have some genetic distinction as well. And this is a group of animals that we are referring to as the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, or the PCFGs. And this is a group that we see during the summertime from about, Crescent City or a little bit farther south, Northern California, all the way up the Oregon, Washington coast and British Columbia into southeastern Alaska. These are animals that migrate into here during spring months and they leave during fall, and they go south down here like other gray whales do most of the time. But there's quite a bit of fuzziness around them as well. A few years ago, Bruce Mate and his tagging group did some tagging of a group of animals off Crescent City in Northern California, about there. And what they found, and I just pulled out about 3 or 4 examples here to look at. All of these were tagged at about the same geographic location, but a little bit, not all at the same time. And if you look at this red one here, it was tagged and immediately headed south to the lagoons, stayed for about a month, came back north to Crescent City, blew right on by there, went up to Vancouver Island for a few weeks, left Vancouver Island, went to Southeast Alaska, came back, and the tag stopped functioning there. And so this is an animal that we considered a PCFG because it was tagged here, but it basically was found throughout this entire geographic range that we have outlined here. There's another one here, the green line indicator, pretty much the same thing. It was tagged when it heads south. It headed south, stayed for about a month, and headed back north, and bounced around off the Oregon coast for several months. I mean, these look like little bounces, but this is 100, 150 miles north and south this way. And we lost track of that one. And then there's this other one that was tagged, and it basically didn't go anywhere. It just stayed in Northern California, Southern Oregon for almost a year. So we have, even within those animals, some distinct groupiness. There's a small group of about 11 animals that every year in May, so if you're interested, another couple of weeks, head up to Langley, Washington, a small town in Puget Sound, where gray whales come and feed on mud shrimp. And these are feeding, this is a Google Earth photo of feeding pits at low tide. You can see that the water is retreated out. So when they're feeding in here, it's only about 5, 6, 7 feet deep, but they can only feed at high tide, but they leave these big obvious feeding pits. And you can stand on the boardwalk, or better yet, you walk out here and watch them at it. And these are behaviorally distinct from the other PCFGs. So what we may have, and we certainly don't know how to completely identify these, but what we may have are several different populations that somewhat overlap in either their feeding areas or their winter areas or their migratory behaviors. One of these, probably the easiest to identify, is what we call these true Easterns that feed up here in kind of a classic textbook way and head to Baja for winter activities. But remember that about half of the animals that have been genetically tested over here are very, very closely allied with these genetically. So some of these Easterns may head up here and veer off and do this instead. And then we have these things that I'm calling the trans-Pacifics, the things like Barbara and Flex and the others that spend summers here and spend winters over here. Now this is a breeding lagoon, and you would think, or these are breeding lagoons, and you'd think that if mating is random, these guys would be all mixed together here, and everything would be just randomly intermixed, but they are not. Somehow they're maintaining their distinction. And if you look down on this side, there still may be a remnant, very, very small, maybe 5 or 10 animals that are true Western gray whales that still do this migration, because we see some doing it. So what I think I'd like to do is to stop right here with just this big question. About the same year that Bruce Mate was doing his tagging studies, we had 2 other big surprises. One was the identification of a gray whale off the coast of Israel in 2010, and then another one a couple of years later off the Namibian coast in South Africa. This is the first evidence ever of any gray whale anywhere in the southern hemisphere. But we are pretty sure there is no extant Atlantic Ocean gray whale population. So both of these animals probably came from the North Pacific someplace. And if you get out your Google Earth again and start at the Mexican breeding lagoons for the winter and track the shortest distance you can get from there to Namibia without going through the Panama, it's about 20,000 kilometers. And 20,000 kilometers is half the distance around this globe. So the point is, this animal is telling us that as gray whales, we can go anywhere on this planet that we decide to go. So I think there's some really important questions that still need to be answered in terms of why they do, but also why most of them don't. We've got a lot of future scenarios that we could talk about, but I think this might be a really good time to stop and see if we have any good questions or even great questions out there.
Wow, Jim, that was just amazing. There's just so much to take in. It's wow, who knew?
Yeah, we thought we knew 20 years ago. It was pretty simple.
Yeah, Jim, actually, while you're on this page, you probably saw that as recently as April 23rd, there was a report of a gray whale sighted off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were about what was happening there.
Did I miss that? I have not heard. It was, okay, was it positively identified by, I mean, gray whales are pretty easy to identify. I mean, even if you didn't know this was a gray whale, if somebody took a picture of it and showed anybody that knows anything about gray whales, you'd know it is.
Yes, I'm quite familiar with gray whales, and I looked at the video, and it is definitely a gray whale.
Do you know if it was I mean, if the video was clear enough that to see if it was a match with either this one 10 years ago?
I don't know. I will be happy to send you the link. Actually, at the end, I could post the link to the article in the chat, so others can see it too. But it's really fascinating. There's some video footage, and yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, the general consensus is certainly that these are not remnant North Atlantic gray whales. To go, 250 years and not see any, and then over a decade have them pop them up like this. So I think that, certainly one of the things that's happening up here is this increasing loss of summer sea ice that makes these pathways, potential migratory pathways, a lot more conceivable than they were half a century ago. And we are getting more and more sightings of gray whales in the summertime along the tops of both of these continents, farther and farther away from the Beaufort Sea up here.
It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Okay, some of our questions from the audience. We have a question about your something mentioned in your book, E. robustus. You suggest that Pacific gray whale populations were likely higher than in historic times when oceans were warmer and there was a greater area of northern feeding grounds available. Related is the question, if ocean warming events presumably expose more extensive northern feeding grounds, why did the warming event around 2000 have such a negative impact on the population?
Oh, okay. Let's see if we can take it from the back end of that.
Okay.
The warming events really have two distinct impacts on gray whales. One is a reduction of sea ice, both in terms of the time that it's prevalent and also the area that it covers. The other is that and that's kind of a long-term, almost climate kind of thing. But the other part of it is that during these severe El Niños and the resulting warming that occurs, we end up with a dramatic reduction in productivity and food availability that could probably be better considered weather as opposed to climate. This is a short-term kind of event that lasts for a year or two, and then it recovers back to or close to what we used to consider normal. And so those two things can be happening at the same time. Reduced sea ice, opening up more feeding grounds at the same time that productivity is being reduced so much that it doesn't matter if they can get to more feeding grounds if there's no food there or a lot less food there when they get there. And this is all in the face too of a continually increasing population size.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that. We have questions about the whales that recently came into the bay. We've had numerous strandings recently of gray whales in the San Francisco Bay Area, and wondering what you know about their causes of death.
Well, in most cases, I don't know about those that you have specifically, but certainly the ones that were worked on earlier in this UME, but also the 99-2000 one, the most obvious consistent thing that we saw was severe emaciation, presumably as a result of starvation. And we talked about this a little bit earlier this evening, that when food gets short, we see gray whales doing things like going into San Francisco Bay and trying to feed when they would not necessarily do that, or not for a very long period of time anyway, during a normal food availability year. We see the same thing up here. We've had several situations where animals have come into river mouths and swimming up river. It looks as though they're searching for food resources that just aren't available anywhere else. And so they're coming into places that are not normal gray whale feeding habitat. So I think that, was it Izzy that said earlier that there was some indication of emaciation or starvation in these animals?
Yes, the one today that washed ashore in Tiburon, Izzy was there and he did say it was very emaciated.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and we actually had a comment from Bill Keener, who is attending the talk tonight, and he said that some of the whales showed evidence of emaciation and others showed evidence of ship strikes. So we think it's a combination of both scenarios. So,
Yeah, and one could be a contributory problem to the other, because if an animal is so emaciated that it's right on the edge of starvation, its ability to move, to avoid potential collision situation, it's not a healthy animal, and so it might be more vulnerable to ship strikes just because of its starvation conditions.
right, and Bill's adding the comment that we have a record for that individual whale that died today. It was in the bay for 41 days. And one can imagine a whale trying to navigate the very, very busy San Francisco Bay with all of its shipping traffic, trying to feed. Yeah, it's no wonder.
Assuming
No
that
wonder.
there's any appropriate feed there.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, because
Okay.
I mentioned earlier that one animal that we worked on several years ago that stranded in the very southern part of Puget Sound, when we did a necropsy on it, its stomach was filled with red algae, and that was all that was in there. And it was extremely emaciated. Again, we did a lipid content check on its blubber, and it was basically lipidless. So it seemed to us like this animal, it was on the verge of death, and it was eating red algae, not to get any nutrition, but just to put something in its stomach, because there's nothing there for it. I mean, it was completely undigested. They just don't have the enzymes to break down plant material.
Okay, and let's see, we have a lot of other questions coming in and some comments. Let's actually talk a little bit about the gray whale that I mentioned off the coast of Italy. We have some information from Elisa Schulman-Janiger that whale that was sighted on April 14th has been seen multiple times, including today. It's the same juvenile gray whale that was seen off Morocco on the 7th of March in Algeria in early April. No match to the Israel or Namibia sightings. So that's great information there. Thank you, Elisa. And then a question from Tanya Smart. Were either of the 2010 or 2011 individuals ever resighted again that we know of?
Over a short period, the 2010 one was seen first here, or at least identified first here off the Israeli coastline, and then a few weeks later it was seen off the coast of Spain. And as far as I know, there haven't been any other sightings after that. This one down here was there for several weeks, and it certainly was showing signs. And this is one of the photographs that was initially taken when it was first sighted, certainly showing kind of the typical signs of body fat loss, this dip here behind the blowholes that is pretty characteristic of that. So this one probably would have been rated as in moderately poor condition when it was first sighted, and we know it was there for several weeks. But this is a very high productivity area. It's a major upwelling area along this coastline. But whether there's anything there appropriate for this kind of feeder, we don't know.
Okay, and question about research. So when you were talking about the Pacific feeding group, we have a question about why did they choose to use radio tags for the offshore work rather than satellite tags? Do you know the answer to that question?
That was just a terminology there.
Oh.
They're satellite tags, but they're
okay.
The radio tags monitored by a satellite.
Got it. Thank you. And another question, is it possible to reestablish the Atlantic gray whale populations? I mean, if we're seeing this activity, what are your thoughts about the possible of a resurgence of a gray whale population?
Well, some people think there are good possibilities. Alter did a paper, and some colleagues did a paper a while back, looking at the possibility, looking at potential areas, 80 years or so down the line, suggesting that there are really important potential feeding areas around the North Atlantic Ocean. But yeah, I think that, a question that I've had is that if this population is pushing the limits of its resources so badly that we see these very serious mortality events occurring, why aren't more of them slipping into the North Atlantic and taking advantage of prey that we know is there, because gray whales used to do this pretty successfully. And it's a question that's just hanging, because we've seen 2 or 3 animals that we know of that have made it over here. Probably more than that have actually done it, but not hundreds, certainly not thousands. The North Atlantic is a rough spot for ship traffic, and they may prefer not Southern California, but at least this portion up here. But there's no real reason that I can see, unless they are tied so tightly to this migration, that if you are going to be a successful adult, you can't go so far across here that you can't then make it back in a timely fashion to get back here for breeding or calving. But that's presuming that we think they are absolutely tied to this area to do that. And we don't even know that for sure. We don't know why they migrate. We have more and more evidence about why that doesn't explain why they migrate, but it just really doesn't. When you see an animal express the capability of doing this and going all the way to Namibia, why not go instead of staying over here and starving to death? We're going to keep working on that.
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see what happens. Question about births of gray whales off the coast of California. We have a participant who makes the comment that, or asks, does it seem like more gray whales are giving birth off the coast of Southern California before making it to the lagoons? Is that something that scientists are observing? And if so, any idea what's happening there?
Melissa could be the one to answer that, because that's her paper, really. But yeah, what seems to be going on is that with warming in the Arctic, winter sea ice forms later every year on average, certainly later than it did 20 or 30 years ago. And so that means that these animals can remain in these feeding grounds longer into the fall before starting their southward migration than they might have done, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And so consequently, if reproductive females are maintaining the same annual reproductive cycle, so that they're going to give birth in January, then if they're staying up here later, when they head south, January hits them when they're in Central California or Southern California. And so it's mostly, we think, a consequence of delayed ice formation and delayed initiation of the southbound migration. So the timing of the migration is changing, but it seems like the timing of the reproductive cycle is not changing.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. We have a question about whale vocalizations. Do gray whales make different sound patterns compared to other types of whales? I think you talked a little bit about this earlier, but maybe you can elaborate. And also, is there evidence that different gray whale populations have their own language, their own sets of vocalizations that they make amongst each other?
Gray whales are hard to study. The vocalizations of gray whales are hard to study, partly because they're not very vocal. In fact, until people started doing work on them in the lagoons back in the 60s, they were generally referred to in the literature as the silent whale, because during migration, when people went out of Scripps or other institutes in Southern California and tried to record vocalizations, they've got whales swimming, sea whales swimming right by them, and they're just not getting anything. We certainly hear some vocalizations in feeding areas. We certainly see them and hear them in reproductive areas. We have no idea what any of them mean, or whether the same kind of vocalization, and there have been a lot of different, very specific kinds of sounds that have been cataloged for gray whales, but we don't know whether they carry any meaning, or do they carry the same meaning every time they're used, or do they carry the same meaning between individuals that use the same sound? We don't know. And the biggest difficulty you could even see with that little clip of video, that if you can't tell what the animal is doing, if you can't even be sure that the sound that you're recording with an underwater microphone is coming from the whale that you're observing, it's really hard to put the cause and effect relationship together. We tried to do that with JJ when we had her in captivity in SeaWorld in 97, 98. And not that she was trying to communicate with somebody else, but we were just trying to determine what kind of vocalizations that she made, and whether we could relate them to any kind of behaviors that we saw. And all we really saw was that over time, from the time she was first brought in, her frequency and variety of vocalizations just went down to essentially nothing. And it almost seemed to us like, there's this baby gray whale doing baby talk, and there's nobody around to teach it how to talk gray whale. And so after a while, it just kind of gave up. Nobody was talking back to it. And so, for the last 6 or 7 months, I don't think anybody heard anything out of her. Mm. But it's hard to connect an action or a behavior or a meaning to a vocalization unless you know for sure what animal it's coming from and what that animal is doing.
Right. Understood. I'll try to get in a few more questions here. There's a question about the Langley whales, the sounders. How do they remain genetically distinct given the overlapping range with the rest of the population?
Well, we don't know if I don't have any evidence that they're genetically distinct. They're certainly behaviorally distinct, but maybe only behaviorally distinct for a very short period of time, because they come into Langley every year, they're there for a couple of weeks, and then they leave. But I don't know if we know. I don't know if anybody knows where they go when they leave. Do they just act like other PCFGs, or do they act like other Eastern North Pacifics? That's just one unique behavior that they do consistently and have been doing year after year after year for, 10 or 12 years now.
Okay, thank you. What can we as citizens who are concerned about these whales do about all the ship strikes that are, occurring? Any suggestions, any research going on that you're aware of that is exciting in this area? And is there anything that, as citizens, you think we could be doing in order to try to curb the instances of whale ship strikes?
Stop buying stuff from China. I know that's a little facetious, but the two things that I've seen that seem to be helpful is one is to try to redefine shipping lanes in heavy ship traffic areas, so that they don't, by deviating just a little bit, they could be out of a migratory behavior or a migratory pattern. And the other, and this is probably the most useful and it's probably going to be the hardest one to get adopted widely, is to reduce ship speed when they're in areas that are likely being occupied by whales. With a slower ship speed, animals have a better chance of evading, and ship captains have a better chance of maneuvering too. But those are the two things that seem to be high on the list of anybody to get new kinds of regulations going. But it's going to be a tough one.
It is, yes. We have a couple of questions relating to possible feeding behavior. One attendee noted that over the last 3 weeks, there have been a group of about 12 or so gray whales around the South Farallon Islands, within a mile of the islands, and they've been showing a dive sequence of taking a single breath and then diving, showing their flukes. And then rather than the usual sequence of 3 to 6 shallow dives and then a deep dive, this is in 110-foot deep water. So the question is that potentially feeding behavior, or what do you think they're doing? And then related to that, there's another question about recent sightings of grays just off the beach at Point Reyes within the surf. Wondering if that is also potentially feeding behavior. So what are your thoughts about those two observations?
Yes, and yeah, I think both of them are probably feeding behaviors. And especially in the context of what I think is a severe food shortage is going on, that these might not be what you would see in normal UME kinds of years, but these are animals that are looking for just about anything. 110 feet is not beyond gray whale. I think gray whales usually, I don't think we have any records of gray whales doing foraging dives in areas deeper than about 70 meters or 250 feet or so. So 100 feet, something like that, isn't going to be pushing them too far. But yeah, in the feeding in the surf, or at least the feeding behavior in the surf, we see that all summer long along the Oregon coast up here, because there are quite a few different kinds of crustaceans, small crab larvae that have these swarming hatches that just really turn the water into soup. But it's right in the breaking wave, and that's where the animal is. And it's really difficult to get a researcher in there with a sampling gear to find out what's going on, because it's a tough, dangerous place to work. But that's not really unusual feeding behavior at all.
Great, yes. Let's see, we have just some feedback from Elisa about the gray whales that have been having calves, moving southbound with calves. She says that gray whales have been passing southbound a few weeks later during the past 3 UMEs, the unusual mortality events. More southbound calves should be seen with late, heavily pregnant females, but few have actually been seen. And counts in all Baja lagoons are much lower due to poor body condition of many females. Just wanted to share that information. She also posted a couple links related to the latest Italian sighting of the gray whale in the Q&A. If people are interested, you can pull those links there. And let's see. Question about Japanese hunting. Is there any Japanese hunting going on related to Western gray whales that you know of?
No.
Okay. And with respect to the calves that are being born outside of the lagoons, is there any evidence of higher mortality for those calves. I don't know if you have any.
That's a good question, and I really wish we knew. I mean, it implies that there's something important about the lagoons for successful rearing of calves, and we don't know that for sure. If there is still a functional Western gray whale population, that's probably a non-lagoon kind of winter location that they use. It's just an open coastline kind of situation. But I don't know of anybody that has actually photo ID'd females along the California coast that have just given birth to follow in any conceivable way to look at potential success or failure. And you need a pretty large sample size to really kind of get a handle on that too.
Mm-hmm. Just a comment about the sounders. Cindy Hansen says that according to Cascadia research, the sounders in North Puget Sound are actually part of the population that migrates up to the Bering and Chusky Seas. They detour into Puget Sound and feed for a few months before continuing on their migration north.
So
and
they
there's,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
So they are Easterns then.
Okay. It says, she says that there's evidence that the ghost shrimp may be helping them get through the UME. In fact, it's thought that they found the area during previous UMEs or times of low prey abundance. So that aligns with what you were suggesting earlier. A question about opportunities to volunteer in Baja or somewhere to help.
This has been a hard year for just that sort of thing. But I mean, one place to volunteer, or a series of places, is with a lot of the ACS chapters have various kinds of shore-based counts. And in Baja, the tricky part is that you can't go as a tourist and get access to most of the lagoon. So I think the easiest thing there, if somebody is really seriously interested in that, is look at the Laguna San Ignacio Ecosystem Science Project, and look at their website and look at the contacts there and follow up on that. But I know that things were somewhat truncated during this past winter because of COVID and just, the problems of getting across international borders. Hopefully that's not going to be an issue next year.
Yes, okay. I think we've gotten through all of our questions. Susan, do you have a question?
I do. I just, Jim, I was so fascinated by the story of Vivara, I think you.
Varvara?
Yeah, that I think you said that in 2011 that was really that was the opening to see the cross migration. And you mentioned she was a female. Do we know anything more about her, even though the communication ended, but you were able to see that she crossed and headed north?
Yeah, she got back in it, and my understanding, we're going back several years now, but my understanding is that there, after that year, there was no more satellite radio tagging of any of the Westerns. And so if any of them are actually still going south along the Asian coastline, we still don't know where they're going.
Oh, that's too bad, because it was really also seemed so positive that Russia was cooperating, a way to cooperate for the common good.
Yeah, and I think that part of the problem, it started becoming political in several different ways and logistical. I mean, that's a rough place to work, just to get to in Sakhalin. And so it's got a lot of potential to continue to study, but I think some of the genetic studies that are going on now are going to continue to shed a little bit more light on some of this.
Thank you. Well, what a great talk. And Jim, thank you. I hope you'll come back again sometime next year, yeah, with any updates. So
I would
thanks
love
so much for all the work.
It'd be nice to get off Zoom and actually come to San Francisco.
Yeah, we'll take you out to dinner.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thank you everybody for showing up tonight. Hope this was useful.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone in attendance for caring about conservation of gray whales. Thank you, Jim.
You bet.
Good
See you
night.
in April.
Good night. All right, bye.